he wants is this upright grave, right? And this is so low to the ground, which both makes it more and less sturdy in a way. But I teach I teach the poems on the nests and mice and badgers and birds and all of that. But I haven't worked on them in this project, and I don't know if I will. I'm not sure if I will. I mean, some of the poems that are important to me there's a poem called The Flitting that's about kind of his home and moving from his home. The I Am poems, his journal out of essays, is also something that I write about at some length, a little essay on self-identity. And they're also kind of tying into this, somewhat related to the question about whether there's poetry in the journal is, at about the same time he writes a couple poems of these kind of horrible nightmare poems. So one's called A Dream, I think one's called Nightmare. And they're just these kind of endless, painful descriptions of, what here he just, in half a sentence says, spent the night in hell, basically. So.
I have a simple question, then I'll follow that up. First of all, what is your definition of poetry? Because it does, I guess this ties with Professor Garelick's question as well, because your argument of the dissociative connection between biology and poetry is based on Claire's writing within the genre style of journal writing, and then the genre of epitaph. So it seems as though we have a very expansive definition of poetry and poetics using Claire. So I just wanted to ask you that simple question.
I do have a pretty expansive, the way in which I'm thinking about poetry here is almost to say just literature. And then what do you mean by literature, right? And in that sense, it would be a scene of irresolvability, of textual irresolvability. It's basically kind of the most kind of general notion of poetry or literature that I'd be using here has to deal with that moment in which there's question rather than resolution in a text. So pretty capacious. At the same time, there's a particular history of what a poet is that I'm also engaging. So those are not necessarily identical and overlapping, but my definition of poetry is quite broad, but at the same time, and another way of saying it would be romanticism is poetry. But at the same time, I'm interested in the way in which this story has gotten told very specifically. So.
Good. Any other questions?
I'm not sure if it's a question. I was struck by the word hope in his inscription, and it seemed to me like in this way he's inscribing the journal as making the journal his tomb and inscribing his hopes in the journal. And so in that way he does obtain his grave the way he wants it by the journal. But that makes it go back to an inscription of a literary form rather than a bodily form.
Mm-hmm. And it's ironic too, right? Because what is a journal but a kind of writing that assumes lived experience, right? That assumes the day-to-day life, the living life, the lived body, as opposed to the epitaph, or as opposed to the lyric, which are producing a kind of life beyond life. Now, these oppositions, and this is why kind of Demand's work on the relation between autobiography and epitaph is, in Wordsworth is really at the background here, and there's the question about Claire's complaints about the boys, because one of the other texts that's kind of lingering in the background here that some of you probably know is Wordsworth's Boy of Winander, and there was a boy you knew him well, and that is a kind of central text for Demans, thinking about the relation between, say, life writing and death writing. But your other point, which I think you're making, is how the here functions. It's not just how the hope functions, but how here functions, right? Because what happens when you use the deictic, right? What happens when you use here on a text, in a text? What does it point to, right? So, I mean, I think what you're suggesting, rightly, is that here conjoins the grave and the journal, because the here occurs in the journal and on this sketch within the journal, right? That is a object that never comes into being, that exists only in the here. That's the here of the journal, right? So I think that is what's implied in your question, that the journal and the epitaph turn out to be more similar. And what I kind of wanted to suggest there, what I was interested in, is that what is Claire's hope? So one of Claire's hopes is to get beyond biological life, right? But the very gesture through which you would get beyond biological life and live on through posterity is the same gesture that reattaches him to his biological situation, that returns him to being mere body, right? So there's this tension in Claire's hopes between a kind of living on beyond the body and the vehicle for that living on as being this kind of this mere body. And that's something that that doesn't get resolved, but it's actually a pretty radical notion in Claire, and it's more radical than our conventional sense of what a grave might do. And it's very much not what this grave is doing, and it is what this grave is doing, right? Because what this grave is doing is just immediately conjoining biological life and poetic genius or poetry, right? That the life of a poem or the life of a poet is his, maybe hers, but certainly his here, biological life, it's natural life. So despite the apparent difference between these two graves, they end up having a kind of unlikely similarity in the way in which they construe of the relation between poetry as a power over life, or life as a vehicle of poetry. And so, I mean, I think this does also keep getting back to the question of, so what does thinking about life in the 19th century and 19th century poetry have to do with thinking about biopolitics as the management of collectivity, or the management of bodies through hospitals? How is poetry like hospitals, or like today Facebook, or like all the examples of our biopolitical regime that we have? And I think that that's the question, is how does poetry, and when or how does poetry conceive of bodies as its vehicle? How does poetry get, a better way, because that just animates poetry the way I said it, how is poetry construed as conceiving of bodies and living bodies as its vehicle, as the vehicle of its existence? And these two graves are two examples of that scenario.
Good, any other questions? If not, then thanks one more time for accepting our invitation. And